Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome Simon Rattle. We're going to have a chat about various aspects of Baroque music and probably some other aspects of life that don't concern Baroque music, but who knows? Who knows where this will lead? So one of the things that people ask me is how Simon and I met first time. I mean, we knew of each other, but I seem to remember it was on the steps of the Royal Academy of Music in London. We were introduced to each other by a mutual friend, Miranda, who played the violin. And in fact, it was after a concert that you had done at the Academy as a student. Were you still a student then?
Oh, surely. I must have been. I mean, it's typical. I mean, of course, we are very old and good friends. I don't remember anything about the music, but I remember very clearly meeting you on the steps. Little did I know that half a century later, we would still be having these conversations.
Yes, I know. But I can tell you the music was Appalachian Spring by Copland and Strauss Metamorphosen. And it was
whoever came up with that program, I must have.
Yeah. Yes. And but you had pulled this orchestra together, had you?
I mean, that was kind of what I did. Since we don't have our own instrument in our house, which is tragic and would be very useful, I spent most of my time just cajoling, badgering, blackmailing people to play.
And I take your example when young conductors say to me, how am I going to get my experience? So I say to them, you just have to get your friends together and put an orchestra together. And if you're any good, they'll come. And that is what happens even now.
Well, build it and they will come.
Yes.
But I remember, I mean, I must have got 5 viola players because it was Strauss Metamorphosen. But I always remember that violas and bassoons were the hardest to persuade.
That's great. So what stage were you at that point? I mean, had you won the John Player competition already by then?
You don't remember the year, do you?
75.
Yes, then I must already have been in Bournemouth.
Yes, I see. So, right.
Okay. Sometimes trying to play Baroque music there with not great success.
Tell us what Baroque music did you do? Do you remember?
Well, look, I mean, my Baroque life started actually at the age of 12 because I did play the harpsichord, although I never studied the harpsichord. I mean, Nicholas is the proper harpsichord player. I mean, he can really play Brandenburg Fifth, whereas I could only play Brandenburg Fifth with a group of enthusiastic people who were rather drunk. But I did have some wonderful amateur music making friends in all different professions. There were 6 or 7 of us who met regularly, about every couple of weeks, and simply played Baroque music at the house of this oboe player who was a printer, with a Baroque violinist who was a long-distance lorry driver, with a recorder player who was a history teacher. And I simply learnt that at the feet of them. And David Dutch was the name of the man whose house it was, who ran something called the Liverpool Mozart Players. And it was with David Dutch that I went to hear the first, as far as we know, the first ever complete performance of Rameau's Les Boréades at the Proms, conducted by John Eliot Gardiner. So you weren't playing in that, were you?
I wasn't. I'd already left by that time.
But this was the point also where listening to this, aged, I suppose I must have been 17, 18, where I felt, oh no, this music has to be part of my life, whatever.
Yes.
And it was
Right.
actually Rameau that was my key into this more than anything else.
So you then became really enamored of Les Boréades, didn't you? And decided that, well, I suppose it was the first Baroque opera that you conducted, was it?
Yes, absolutely. I was given the chance when the Salzburg Festival came to me and said, "What would you most like to do?" Expecting, I don't know, the Ring Cycle or something even larger. They were completely stunned to find that I said, "Well, if you really mean this, Les Boréades is the piece I would most love to do." And I had worked on it already, the orchestral music, quite a lot in Birmingham with the CBSO, as you had. We had played these extraordinary suites, and I was really then ready to go and jump into that.
Well, let's hear a little bit of this. And I think it's with the Bavarian Radio Orchestra.
It is, and this will be the orchestra that I become the conductor of in 2.5 years, and it's the most recent Baroque music that I was able to record. It was just before lockdown, and I've loved the orchestra for years, but I'd never played any Baroque music with them, and I was very interested to see, well, how would this be? The bassoon player Marco Postingal, who is the principal bassoon there, is one of my closest friends and is also a Baroque music expert, plays for John Elliott, knows everything about Rameau, seems to know everything about everything. The orchestra called him Marcopedia. And so, in fact, we had the 4 bassoons right by my right elbow.
Oh.
And I mean, there were certainly at least 2 conductors in this performance, but if you had to choose one, it probably would have been Marco. But he was able to give all kinds of colors and phrases and stories which would actually help people to understand this very, very special world. And I must say, I was thrilled with how they played the music. And they, of course, were, as every other orchestra is, overwhelmed to play the music. Some of the most beautiful music ever written, Baroque or otherwise.
that was an entree from Simon Rattle's recording of Les Boréades with the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra.
Can I ask you a question now?
Yes, please do.
I realized after all these years, I never asked you. I mean, who was your greatest influence as a Baroque conductor? I mean, do you have, is it one or two?
Well,
where did you start?
1 or 10, I think you might say. I was very much under the influence of Raymond Leppard when I was in my late teens, because I saw him do something that I hadn't seen anybody else do, and that was sit at the harpsichord and get the most extraordinary sound and spring from a chamber orchestra without raising his hands even. He did everything from his shoulders, really. I mean, you saw him
Yes, of course.
work in those days. And I was enormously lucky to have had a couple of sessions with him about, just about continuo playing, really, but also about, he wasn't really telling me how to direct. You didn't have to do that. You just watch him. So he was the first. Thurston Dart had a sort of academic effect on me. I used to read what he said. I used to believe everything he said, and then I threw it out about 5 or 10 years later. But it was always very interesting. John Eliot Gardner has to be a huge influence on my way of approaching early music, because we were sort of, he always said that it was something that it was so instinctive. He really didn't want to be thought of as an academic. And I mean, Music of the Baroque have heard so much about John Eliot. In fact, you've already had interviews with him, I know. So he's very learned, but on the other hand, he always, when we were working on the Rameau operas in the early 70s, he always said, I don't want to read books about this. I just feel it. It's so instinctive how you do the ornaments. People asking, what does it say in this book? Forget the books. You just do it as you would. And the best way to demonstrate them was always to sing them, not to play them. So you get this actual vocal way of it.
But I mean, the books are like training wheels on a bicycle, aren't they? I mean,
Yes. They're
really useful when you're starting, but there's a point where you have to give it up.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I had really an extraordinary lucky 2 years, the only 2 years in which David Munrow taught at the Royal Academy of Music. And maybe in America, the name of David Munrow is not well known at all. I mean, he was probably in this field the most extravagantly gifted musician there has ever been. And he was able to play basically every instrument that could be found in any museum. And so his musical range was well over 1,000 years. He committed suicide in his mid-30s, and therefore we had lost the person who would have led the early music movement in the way that John Eliot and Chris Hogwood, in fact, Chris Hogwood was his keyboard player, etc. did. But so I watched it. He made me conduct Machaut, Dufay, for instance, with whoever was there. But it was actually the most astonishingly inspiring musician.
We're going to go back a few years now into the late 70s when I had my own Baroque group. And but I was actually mostly conducting modern orchestras, Manchester Camerata, London Bach Orchestra, various groups like that. And but I have to say that for me, what happened was, as a result of working with period instruments, it affected and infected my approach to modern orchestras. So, and it sort of became a bit of a thing, really. I was in the late 80s, I was invited to Australia to conduct the Australian Chamber Orchestra, whom I'd never heard of. And actually, they were at pretty much the beginning of their life at that time. And I went over to Sydney and was absolutely amazed by how they completely took this idiom without any problem at all. I mean, what was so great was their capacity and willingness to work. I remember we did the Bach First Suite, first orchestral suite, and I remember spending a whole hour on the French overture at the beginning, and they didn't bat an eyelid, and they knew that we needed all this time. But the point is, you could go so much further with a group like that, who were, because still in this country, in the United Kingdom, there were orchestras that said, well, we know how to play this stuff. We do it this way. And it wasn't like that at all with the Australian Chamber Orchestra. And I had such a great time. I went 2 years running. The second year, I took my very, very small children and wife, and we stayed in Sydney and had the most extraordinary time. But of course, they didn't come to concerts, which was a bit of a shame. But what we're going to do is play a little bit of the Telemann Tafel music, which I just discovered. This was extraordinary music. I've done it a lot since, and it has, by any standards of difficulty, the hardest oboe parts ever written in the Baroque era. But they as you will hear, they were quite up to the challenge. So here is the excerpt from Tafel Music 3, Conclusion.